Yeah, you know. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Pritchard, my wife Sharon, who helped me put this all together. So it wouldn't be fair if I didn't begin by introducing Sharon, who many of you know, but she has a strange habit. As a doctor, she had to make a lot of presentations. So she loves making PowerPoints. Isn't that strange? I mean, I hate them. So she does all the work and I love it. So nice to see you all. And copyrighted, that's right. We have a lot of fun with these things, and I appreciate again Sharon's help, and also in the two books that I wrote, memoirs. Sharon was instrumental. Let me say that my objective this morning is to encourage you to write about yourself or somebody who's very important to you. And I'll tell you different ways you can do that. So it can be simple, but it can also be really something that you have an opportunity to express the real excitement of the person's life, the drama, all the things that you know happened and that they don't think are that important. So with that said, I would encourage you to think though about this broadly, and to realize what Ron Hicks said last Sunday. I don't know if you all were here, but he made a wonderful statement. He said, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about UCG is the people. As far as the people in the congregation, I never tire sitting down and hearing their stories. They are so smart and dedicated to so many various causes, all of which I find interesting. And I
changing the slides.
please. We had it all queued up here, and see, Sharon could do this. I could probably just sit down. That was a comment that Ron made in his presentation, and I just thought it was so appropriate for my discussion with you all this morning. Is that the biggest problem I found in giving this lecture and this chat is that people don't really appreciate their own value or the value of important people in their lives, their spouse, their parents, folks like that. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. And I hope this chair holds up as I disappear. But I have to sit down with a back problem, so I'm going to just kind of casually sit like you and go through my comments. Next slide, please. There are various ways that you can do this, by the way. These are all in the same category in literature for all of us literature freaks. I consider myself a memoirist because I love going back into memoirs. But really, if you think about it, everything from the epitaph, the little carving on the stone, or the other things that are done when someone passes, the obituary, which is so diverse in many cases and yet so bland in others, and we'll talk about those, the memoir, the biography, autobiography. These are all in the same class of literature about individuals, about their drama, about their success. A memoir, I think, is an important form of literature because it can include what the other ones can't. It can include history, it can include documentation, fiction, tutorials, textbooks. You guys are late. You're going to get points. Next slide, please. And I think Webster really gives it short shrift when it says, a narrative composed from personal experience. That's really too little to be said about a memoir. Another definition in dictionary.com, a record of events written by a person having intimate knowledge of them and based on personal observation. And that is, I think, better. But the best definition, next slide, please, is to help you first understand the difference here. Biography, and many of you know this, but a biography or autobiography, which is not much difference. One is written by the person, the other was written about that person. But the emphasis is on accuracy, and it's normally in chronological order. That's what it is. On the other hand, the memoir can focus on a portion of a life, as this book I wrote about my 2 years as an officer in Vietnam. 2 years, it took me 50 years to write it. And that's just the sort of stress you'll put into a book, in this case, because it was cathartic, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. But a memoir can also show something very interesting about the subject, which may not appear to be important, but in future generations may well be. We were just talking, librarians, about the importance of the book burnings that happened during World War II. And the fact that the Alexandria Library that Alexandria created was destroyed by a Roman Catholic bishop. It was burned down because he didn't feel it complied with Christian philosophy. All those wonderful documents were lost. So this seems to be a constant phenomena, periodically perking up in the human civilization, that we destroy knowledge of this sort. The best definition, though, next slide, that I found was in a memoir. Can we have another slide, please? Thank you. From a book which you will love if you like recipes. This woman from North Africa married this gentleman from Sicily. And she wrote at the beginning, to write this book, I drew from my personal journals, letters, emails, texts, and my late husband's personal writing. You can't do that in those other documents. When I could, I consulted with several people who appear in the book. The stories told to me, often in dialect, are full of blanks and missing portions that characterize storytelling. Occasionally I conflated, nice term for made up, but that's what you have to do, events into one for clarity. I also omitted people not only when that omission had no impact on the truth or the substance of the story. Otherwise, this book is a true account of experiences as I remember them. That's a wonderful definition of what a memoir is. And I encourage you, if you're interested, because what she did is similar to what I did. My book is centered around the letters I wrote home to my parents and the facts, the truth that contradicted what really I was doing in Vietnam. My book is called A Young Man in War. And I'm, by the way, one of my purposes today is not to help you write memoirs, because there's some wonderful materials on the net that will help you do that. I'm really trying to encourage you to write your memoir, or at least what I'll explain later on, your obituary. The two books that I wrote, as I said, this one was a catharsis. Next slide, please. It was probably one of the most difficult things I did. Sometimes I would spend 24 hours straight just writing, because I had to get certain things off my chest. I had misrepresented to my parents, but as Sharon reassures me, it was understandable, because my objective was to not worry my parents. And I was an advisor in 4 Corps in a program called Phoenix, which is notorious. And if you read the book, you'll hear more about it. But it's an interesting thing. I always find, to me, the most important sentence you write in the whole book, any book, I've written books for National Geographic, whatever else, is the first sentence. It will capture the imagination, and hopefully will capture the way you as an individual are, in fact, please, there's seats here in front. It's not, this is more of a classroom setting than but I thought it was important. So this is my first sentence, and I'd like for you to hear it. If there was a baptism in Vietnam, it wasn't by fire. It was from the humid, dusty, sun-dried wash of the helicopters mixed with the sweaty uncertainty of living or dying. That really was written probably with more stress than anything else because it was my effort to capture the rest of the book. In the same sense, in this book, you get a kick out of it, but it is not a catharsis as much as it is an effort to show experiences that my peers had, and they're not recognized. Wonderful people marched in who fought against the famous James Watt, the Reagan administration, others. They were wonderful people, environmentalists, conservationists, all of us, and how we did it in various ways. And I wanted to document that. And so it really was more or less a history of conservation. And there were two sections in the book that I write about in detail. One I call the era of conservation, and the other one is the era or the age of environmentalism. And if you're interested in those, the distinction, you might be interested in reading the book. But here's the beginning sentence from this book. The witch's dance of Shakespeare's Macbeth, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, could be a scene in state capitals in Washington where money, power, and egos are constantly added to the cauldron. Witches can be good or bad, have good or bad intentions, according to historians, which I didn't realize. Somewhere today, high heels and wingtips, others wear sneakers and sandals. I was part of those lawyers, charity advocates, corporate lobbyists, citizen leaders, all trying to brew what some believed the nation needed or what others knew would benefit a few. The cauldron was my sailing boat on turbulent seas. First sentence, very important, but don't let that stop you. The most important thing is to get your outline down and to get working on it. These two books, by the way, I said, I'm not here to tell you how to write a memoir. And as I said, there are several good websites that do that without any charge. And then there are those people who are consultants who you may want to hire to help you put something together. But the memoir itself is, to me, or I think I went off, maybe I just, there you go. I'll face you all. Okay. So with that said, I'd like to move on now to a couple of stories in the voyage, because I think you might enjoy them. I grew up in Kansas City, and slide, please.
Next slide.
Next slide. There we are. But this is from this book, so I'll talk about that first. As a lieutenant advisor working in the jungle, in one section in chapter 1, if there was a baptism, I read that. In chapter 4, on the trail I followed, in the trail of the Vietnamese soldier in front of me. Still, the explosion was unexpected. I felt its pressure on my back. I thought I had been hit by a mine. The soldier behind me had been blown apart. What was on my back was part of him. Now, there's no way you could tell your parents about that. And so the letter home said, "A million thanks for the care package. Right now, I'm munching on some Cracker Jacks. Did you get the box with the robe? I had sent my mother a silk robe that I could buy over there. It's handmade. Today, we have a few minutes of spare time, so a friend and assistants joined me out in the paddies to practice with our rifles. That's all the news from now." You can see why sometimes a memoir is the presentation of really what had happened or how it happened. In the same sense, next slide, please. As I read to you the introduction to that book, I want to tell you two stories that occurred in my experience in Washington, so you understand why I referred to witches and I referred to voyages. Could you go to the next slide? The Florida Panther. During this period, while I was in Washington from 1977 to 1996, I was the president of the National Parks and Conservation Association. I was also a deputy director in Interior, and I was also the head of the Appalachian Trail Conference. So if you've hiked on the Appalachian Trail, we have a lot to talk about. And other experiences. I was Jimmy Carter's chief of natural resources when he was governor, and I was an advisor staff member to him in Washington. So I've been very blessed with wonderful experiences, which I try to cover honestly, and that's very important. As I said, the important thing about a memoir is its accuracy. One of the experiences was the story that I tell about the Florida Panther. I was driving back with my wife and two children to our home in Washington from staying with my parents, they were grandparents. And we were talking about the fact that the children of Florida, many of you may know this, have voted the Florida Panther to be the most important animal, the state animal. And this happened, and my two sons got such a kick out of that, and they were talking about what they could do in their community. And then they said, Dad, what are you doing about the panther, though? They're disappearing. And I realized, with all the resources I had and all the influence I had, that I could do something about this. When I got back, out of the blue, are you all familiar with Matrix Essentials Cosmetics? We got a grant from Matrix Essentials to do with as we felt in the best interest of conservation. I contacted the people in Florida with the Fish and Game, and I contacted the Everglades Coalition and the other groups that I was part of. And the question was, what haven't we done, and how can we return the panther, which we're down to less than 20, to the state of Florida? And they told me they've tried everything they could. They tried increasing the bait, what's called the prey base, in other words, the food. They've tried other things that were pathways under roads and over roads. And they said, we just don't have a good enough breeding stock. I'm using all their terms now, all these scientific terms these wildlife guys use. They said, the irony is in Texas, they have Texas cougars. And by the way, you might be interested, that animal has more names in science than any other animal. Cougar, panther, mountain lion, I mean, they're puma. It's really quite interesting. And they said, Texas has got all these cougars and they don't know what to do with them, so they're going to exterminate them, so to speak. And I said, well, what do you need to bring them to Florida, which was what they were saying. And they said, well, we don't have the money and we don't have the legal permission to transfer wildlife from one state to another to do this sort of thing. And I said, well, if you can get that letter from the Fish and Wildlife Service, which was a sister agency where I had been, and I knew the people who were there, so I talked to them. They approved on a one-time basis transferring panthers from Texas to Florida. But what we had to do was pay for the capture, the quarantine in the Houston Zoo for 2 weeks so that they were healthy, the transportation, they had their own private jet, getting into Tampa, and then the taking of the panthers out into the Big Cypress, which was the main habitat area. couple of weeks after they had gone through this process of about 20 panthers, male and female, I got a call and they said, why don't you come down for the release of the first one, since you guys helped make it possible. So my wife and I went down to Sun City and that area, and then went where they had the panthers in a pen. And this female panther was in there, and part of the period was for them to be in pens, so they were acclimatized. But there's not much difference between Texas and South Florida, and this wasn't that difficult for them. And then we stood there with them back some 50 feet back and behind a fence and behind the screen, so that it, quote, couldn't see us, although we all knew that it could see us. It knew we were there. And they raised the door. I can still remember it. And the panther looked around and then just walked out. Didn't run, just kind of walked around and moved out. And today there are close to 200 panthers in Florida. And we're very, very proud of that. And you can thank the state people. That's the sort of experience that you just never know. You're driving down a road and your kids say, why don't you do something about that? For many of us, we couldn't do anything about it. But in that instance, I had the blessing of that grant that came through. A second story, which I want to tell you, if you'll change the slide, is about the tall grass prairie. I grew up in Kansas City. Anybody else? We got any Middle Westerners? Well, let me tell you, the book, one of the parts of the book, the first section of the book is about what it was like to grow up in Kansas City. And believe me, it was different from anybody else I know. So if you do read it, I think you'll enjoy it. It's just the first couple of chapters. But Kansas City was a world, is a world, I guess, still to this day. But when I grew up, it was a world into its own, because it was transitioning from a cow town, like many cities, to a city of sophistication and industry and commerce, and that made it what it is today. But the tall grass prairie, across the wide swath of America, from Indiana all the way to Colorado, was the tall grass. It was what we sing about, the amber waves of grain, the large, high Spartina, different, not Spartina, but grasses that grow in the prairie, grasses that could grow so high that one man wrote about tying them over the saddle of his horse. The grass was that high. And those areas had all disappeared because they had been plowed, or they had been destroyed in some way, or urbanization or whatever. And today there's just a very narrow swath, maybe 100 miles wide, rather than running all that 1,000 of miles, that goes from Canada to North Texas. In the process, Kansans, and in particular scientists, have said, we need to save that. We need to save just a portion of it for our national park system. And that's what we had not done. And this, the first person who wrote about it was an editor of a newspaper who said, the prairie is disappearing before us. It's not here today, except with exceptions, Scotch across the area. We need to do something about it. For a long time, E. Raymond Hall, a great scientist, University of Kansas, agronomist, others had said, let's do this. But politicians had opposed it. Every politician had opposed it, because it was an insult to, quote, private property rights, some said. But to others, honestly, they knew this land was very valuable for cattle grazing. And the cattle ranches in Kansas and all the way down to North Texas were very much opposed to any national park being carved out of their domain. So we got a call one day from a group of citizens who said, there's only one more chance, and that is a ranch that's up for sale. And I was in my office in Washington with the National Parks and Conservation Association. And so, having grown up in Kansas City, I knew this story. I knew how important this was. Most of what we did at MPCA was done by a very good policy staff who worked with Congress. And we had put together what's called the Omnibus Parks Act. Those are acts that have, Congress doesn't have time to deal with each little park adjustment, property boundary, so forth, individually. So what they do is they, over about a 10 to 20-year period, they'll assemble all these various park issues and have one act, an Omnibus Parks Act, which covers, well, in this case, it was 50 parks. And this was the early 1990s. And we had, as the National Parks Association, had been the leaders of the effort to assemble this. Various conservation groups, as I mentioned in the book, will take the lead on the issues that they're most have the strongest talent with. Clean air, clean water, whatever, wildlife issues. So in this period, we took a flight out to Kansas City, and there have been a number of meetings with local citizens. And in one case, they had actually forced the Secretary of Interior helicopter not to land. They were so opposed to any discussion about a Tallgrass Prairie National Park unit being established in Kansas. So we went out and decided we weren't going to say anything at all. We weren't interested in talking to the media. And we happened to be able to get $2 million that I had raised from various sources. And so in the process, this one ranch, the Z-Bar Ranch, 12,000 acres, 2,000 head of cattle were on it, came up for sale. And we notified my board that we wanted to use that $2 million that we had in reserves for the acquisition of the option on that property. And so in the process, we got that option. Now, I will tell you, there are a lot of people who, when they found out about it, example, you've ever heard of the Bass family in Texas, the oil and gas family? Boy, they were mad as hell. They were really upset that we had snuck in and bought this property, and they were trying to do everything they could to counter our acquisition of this property. Our hope was, of course, we could get it passed by Congress, but Senator Nancy Kassebaum, Senator Robert Dole, all the members of the Congress, with minor exception, had opposed the creation of this park. And you can't really create a park in a district, a congressional or a Senate district, without their approval. So we announced we were not only going to buy it, but we were going to hold on to it until they were gone. They didn't like that. They didn't like that at all, but they knew we were going to do it. So Kassebaum turned around. It was her last year in the Senate. Dole was running against Bill Clinton for president, if you remember that. Bob Dole had never done a single conservation thing in his life. I'm not saying he's a bad guy. It's just that that wasn't his shtick. Kassebaum had openly opposed the Tallgrass Prairie. She had come up with such clever things as, well, if you guys are going to create a Tallgrass Prairie, 12,000 acres, I'm going to take off 12,000 acres off Fort Riley. And the Army, of course, was opposed to that. And so here we were in the middle of this controversy, and we just said, we're going to do what we can do. So in the process, I got a call from the White House. From the White House. A staff member of Al Gore's called me and said, we don't want this legislation to move forward. Save it for the next session after Bill Clinton is reelected. Well, that was pretty ballsy on their part. But they knew that I was the one who had the greatest influence on the Omnibus Parks Act. And what they were asking us to do was put it off, but Nancy Kassebaum wouldn't be there, and she had at least signed on the bill. Trent Lott, who many of you know of, was the majority leader in the Senate. He had a piece of the bill. One of the national parks in his district was being expanded. He wanted that bill through. He had promised Nancy Kassebaum and me, he said, this is controversial, but I'm going to get of the Senate session. And he meant it. So we knew we had a bill that would make it through the Congress in the last 5 minutes. In the process, I talked to my counterparts because we were not the only people who have worked on legislation. And they all said, we want to go forward with this bill. We don't care what Al Gore and Bill Clinton, they're concerned about being reelected. Believe it or not, Bill Clinton thought that Bob Dole might take credit for a national park in his home state, which was totally ridiculous. Bob Dole could care less about national parks or anything conservation. So we came back and I called the staff member, and I knew her well enough to be able to call back and forth. And I said, I've talked to all the parties. I'd actually called Nancy Kassebaum at home. She was having dinner. She said, well, it's up to you, but as far as I'm concerned, this is your only chance, Paul. So in the process, I had said to the White House, we were going to move forward the bill. And let me tell you what happened. After the election, Bill Clinton was reelected. My board members started getting calls from White House staff saying, we're not going to be able to work with Pritchard anymore. And so after 19 years, the board said, thank you very much, but we're going to have to let you go. And you know, it was probably the best thing that happened to me but that's in the book. That wouldn't happen, wouldn't be written about, except that I knew it, the people knew it, I had the documentation. And as I said, it's very important that you have accuracy in these memoirs and that you not use them for any vendetta against or criticism of another person unless you've got the facts. Yes, ma'am. The Senate and the House both passed the bill, and Clinton made us wait until after the election for him to sign it, but it would have become law because of the number of votes it had if he hadn't signed it. So he took credit for it after the election, but and I wasn't invited to the signing, by the way, which was typical. But bills are passed by the number of votes they receive. If it's a number, if there are a large number of votes in both the House and the Senate, then the president doesn't have to sign it. It automatically is passed. So this was one of those that would have been automatically passed, but he wanted to take credit for it. I'm going to finish up by just mentioning one other. Next slide, please. To me, it's important, if nothing else, write your own epitaph. You might think, well, most of those are just your name and the date of your life. And for most people, it is. But I give you some examples of some cute ones. Of course, the famous poet Keats wrote, here lies one whose name is writ in water, because he felt so frustrated that he had not been successful. And so that's what his epitaph was. And another one was a golfer. And he wrote one which I thought was really cute that you might enjoy. And all his says is, a dedicated golfer, at last a hole in one. That was what his epitaph was. This is important though, because, and you may say, well, that's really not that important. Here's the local paper. And the paper has, as you can see, very short summaries. This is today's death notices. Those simply say the name of the person, where they lived, in this case, mostly all of them are Gainesville, and the years that they lived. That's legally required for the newspaper to print those if they're submitted to them, and that is the only record that many people have in their entire life is right there. On the other hand, obituaries, to me, next slide, please, are sometimes a mini memoir. They're the things in life that we oftentimes, with individuals, we don't want to talk about. Gee, have you written your obituary? I have, and you should, because you're the best informed to know what it's all about. Here's what happened when three people didn't, two people, two sets. The first one was when I ended up having to write the obituary for a fellow in Kansas City who'd been the first Kansas City motorcycle policeman. He was on right out of the Keystone Cops. You all remember those guys flying into trees and everything. Well, he did that. And he had to climb down from the tree. There was no ambulance that was going to come and take care of him. He had to fix his motorcycle, get back on it, and go back to work. And that story was so funny when his wife told me that I put that in the obituary. She loved the obituary. Now, was that what he wanted to be remembered by? Maybe, maybe not. But it was a great experience. That was my experience as a reporter, that I had to, whenever you were sitting there at the city desk and you were reporting and you didn't have anything working on, the editors would call you and say, take this obituary. And that was your job. So most of them are written by individuals who have no connection to the deceased. Reporters, mortuary secretaries, that's one of their primary jobs, is the secretary who greets you at the door writing the obituary. And if you'll notice, most of them say at the end of the obituary, the name of the mortuary. Duncan Brothers Funeral Home, for more information, so forth and so on. The irony is that it may be the one time, though, the deceased is acknowledged as having been on this earth. And that's why it's important that at least the obituary have something more than just the years you lived and your name and where you lived. But I'll tell you this much, those documents, for those of us who've done ancestry sort of work, newspapers are a major source, and it's this section where you get that information. Next slide, please. Basically, the essential information in the obituary is the name, education, date of birth, so forth. And you can include other information. Now, I want to finish by telling you, though, next slide, please, a couple of obituaries that were written by family members. The first one, the daughters wrote, and it sounds appropriate for today. That's why I chose it in this, given the election that's coming. He wanted to avoid making a decision in the pending presidential election. I thought that was so funny. A son wrote, this was his mother, 94, passed away peacefully. She left behind a lot of stuff to her daughter and sons who have no idea what to do with it.
My kids are gonna stay there.
And it goes on, here's an inventory of the thing. This is in her obituary. 2 televisions, the old type. I remember that was ridiculous. Is that what you want to be said about you? There was also one that I thought was really, really charming. And I don't know who wrote it. Sharon's guess was that he wrote it. She thought that, but anyway, it was from the Gainesville Sun just recently. Born on Christmas Day, 1945, it was an auspicious beginning for James. After his father's service in the Navy, his parents returned to Long Island. There, James swam in the surf and sold sweets from his radio flyer wagon. And it's really quite charming, the rest of it. And I think he did write it. I mean, who would know that other than James? Well, next slide, please. There's only the purpose of the obituary then is to make sure that there's acknowledgement. It's the newspapers, those are the official papers, by the way. They have to print that, the obituary or the notice of death, just as they have to provide the government notices. So the two things that every newspaper, they're chosen for each political district. And they have two functions that they have to provide to have that legal recognition. And that is government notices, this section here, and the obituary. So it's very important that you realize the importance of having that information. And it's also important for your children, your grandchildren, and others to know, if nothing else, the time and the dates and anything you want to have printed in there. And it doesn't matter your age. In the Army, we were told, here we were 20, 22, whatever. And the first thing we did when we sat down was we were told, write your will. We had to write our will. So, you know, obviously not all of us were going to Vietnam. A few of us were, but everybody did that. So I tell you this, it doesn't matter what your age is, you need to write this information down rather than leaving it up to others. Next slide, please. Yes, please.
Gainesville Sun is that Thursdays is when African-American obituaries are in there. And now it's once in a while you see a Caucasian also. But I almost wanted to make sure I have mine published on Thursday.
It is the strangest thing. It is right out of the Gainesville Sun segregates their obituaries. If you look at them, again.
And you have some next.
Now they'll occasionally, just recently they had one page of black and then the facing page with blacks and one white person. Very strange, very strange. I don't know how they can legally do that because sometimes it's all black, but that's what they do. I didn't realize it was on Thursdays, but I did notice that was yeah. Anyway, well, enough said. We can go to question and answers, but I just want to tell you, could you go back, please? Mark Twain, wonderful insights writing. Don't underestimate your importance to your family for generations to come, your community, and your profession. Don't burden others with your obituary or your memoir, which is really an obituary writ large. Can I answer any questions or any other comments that individuals want to make? As I said, these are two of them I've written. I've written a number of books with National Geographic and with other sources, but these were the two that really made me think and concentrate on my. Yeah.
Are you working on another?
You know, it's a good question. Because we're on Zoom, we want to be sure we got your question.
Yeah, I was asking if you're working on another memoir.
There, in literature, there are oftentimes three documents that individuals will try to write a trilogy, as it's called, and that would make mine a trilogy. And I've thought about that, but honestly, it is so demanding. This was just published September the 10th, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm exhausted intellectually. So I'm not sure I will, but it might be fun. But I don't want to tell Sharon that because she'll probably kill me. So, yes, Mary.
Where can we buy it?
It's on Amazon. I didn't want this to be a promotion of my books, but both of them are on Amazon. This one was selected to be in the Library of Congress, which I'm very proud of. And this one, I understand, the Library of the Department of Interior.
CG though, that's the most important.
I don't know. Do they have a contributors library? Well, I'll be sure they give it to them. Other,
How did you?
good question. There are a number of ways that you can publish. Self-publishing is most common today. Most books are published by the individual through various companies, and you simply pay a certain amount. And they'll do anything you want for them. They'll edit, or they'll just take it as it is. They'll help you choose your covers, on and on. Some of them will even ghostwrite, which I don't think is legit, but that's all right. Then, of course, there's the former older way, which was to send it out to all these editors, and you have to go through an editor to get it to a publisher. And if you're not from New York City, it is very difficult. It is years in the constant critique, comments. Having worked with a number of editors, I will tell you, most of them are frustrated writers. And they will take your book and suggest things that sometimes you think, that's not what I want to write, you know? And sometimes they'll say things that you really should write. This book was, I said to several people beforehand, and they sent it back and gave me some really critical comments that totally turned this book around. From being more of a tutorial on how to do it to one about what my experience was. I've done it both ways. This one is published by a very nice firm, which is more of a hybrid, Palmetto Publishing. This one, I just simply did the work through Amazon. They have a publishing arm, and then they put it right into their system. But both of them are on Amazon. And if you're interested, I have personal cards that have the book names on them. If you, Mary and others are interested, it says on the back. But I will tell you, hiring somebody to help you do it, I encourage you first just to sit down and really think it through. Write out your outline, what you want, what your objective is. But just sitting here before this discussion, I will simply say, as Mark Twain said, here I was talking to two wonderful people about books, a part of America's history which should be recorded. It should be recorded by librarians who are the most knowledgeable about it. And knowing you, Mary, and your work with Sharon and others around here, Mary, what you've done with music, I mean, there's just so many stories that you all have. That's why Ron Hicks' comment was so important at the beginning, which was repeated by Mark Twain basically at the end. You shouldn't let your last breath, you wouldn't let someone else take your last breath. You shouldn't let someone else write your history. Thank you all very much. Great to.
Yeah.
I'll put these out.